Hello and welcome to World News on TVP World. I'm Marie Cato. Now for some breaking news from Germany, where an agreement was reached on a debt brake reform. The CDU, CSU and SPD parties' push for the change was finally joined by the Greens party. The agreement opens doors for a constitutional amendment of the debt brake rule, the so-called Schuldenbremse, which limits government borrowing. This change would allow for greater funding for German defense and military aid. In Germany, a constitutional amendment requires a two-thirds majority in parliament. Originally, the idea was only supported by the CDU and SCU and SPD parties. But now, with the assistance of the Greens, the three political factions could set the wheels of change in motion. The proposed reform includes establishing a special €500 billion fund for infrastructure reconstruction. The measure would also free up enough funds to push Germany's defense spending to above 2% of its GDP. After the days-long marathon talks in Brussels, all 27 European ambassadors, including the Hungarian representative, voted in support of extending EU sanctions against roughly 2,400 individuals involved in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there is a catch. 7 names were taken off the list at the behest of Budapest. We are now joined by our EU correspondent Angela Skujins from the Belgian capital. Angela, what else can you tell us about this announcement?
Yes, so we heard this morning at roughly 10 a.m. that all the 27 EU representatives, including that ambassador from Hungary, vowed to reinstate, to roll over the sanctions targeting those individuals. A significant amount of those 2,400 individuals are Russian, and they have been targeted by these sanctions from the EU for their ongoing involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, they've been hit with frozen assets as well as travel bans into the EU, and there was much consternation regarding whether Hungary would support the proposal. But what we've heard from the corridors of power, that a deal had to be brokered. 7 names were taken off that list. 3 were deceased. 1 was not a controversial name to remove, but the remaining 3 have question marks hanging over their head. Now, the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has reiterated that he doesn't want to support any EU instrument that could risk the wafer-thin ceasefire negotiations currently ongoing between Russia and Ukraine. But a reporter asked the European Commission this today at a press conference, specifically around when and if any sanctions against the Kremlin would be wound up. Let's take a listen to what they said in their reply.
When it comes to timing, we will not be able to disclose any of this, and also, again, as said yesterday, will not engage into if scenarios, but we know very well that our sanctions are working, they are biting and crippling Russia's economy, and this is exactly the intended effect, because what we want to achieve with this is to ensure that Ukraine is strong and Russia doesn't have the money and the fuel to put in his war machine.
What we've also heard is that work is currently underway for a 17th sanction package. But yes, questions do remain regarding how Hungary will vote in support of the measure, when and if. Just recently last week, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban torpedoed any EU support for Ukraine in the form of a military initiative. But there is another European Council summit next week where this will be at the top of the agenda once again. But that's all from Brussels. I'll send it back to you in Warsaw.
Many thanks. That's Angela Skujins reporting live from Brussels. Vladimir Putin questioned the US brokered proposal for a ceasefire, setting forth a set of conditions and demands. While agreeing with the proposal to cease hostilities, Putin reiterated claims that the current Ukrainian government is part of the underlying problem. Speaking during a joint press conference with Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, Putin demanded several concessions from Ukraine, including that Kyiv stop mobilization and training of troops and other nations stop supplying weapons to the war-torn country. At the same time, Putin called the US idea, quote, great and correct, adding that it still needed to be discussed. Additionally, during the conference, Vladimir Putin floated the idea of talking the deal over on the phone. And now we turn to our Ukraine correspondent, Oz Katerji. Good afternoon, Oz. So what are the reactions in Kyiv to all of that?
Well, Zelensky put out a very forceful statement last night accusing Putin of being manipulative, trying to manipulate Donald Trump. Also said that rejected his idea of these conditions, these preconditions, with Zelensky reiterating that he accepted the ceasefire proposal without preconditions. These preconditions on Ukraine would effectively prevent Ukraine from being able to mount an effective defense once the ceasefire was over. Ukraine is not accepting Putin's words on this as a given. And, Zelensky particularly pointed to Donald Trump and said, don't let Putin manipulate you, keep the pressure up on Russia to comply with this ceasefire proposal. Look, a lot of uncertainty about how Washington views what Putin said. We had Donald Trump's words given on Thursday night, but we're still no clearer as to how the US is going to pursue moving forward, what proposals the US is prepared to accept from Russia, what conditions. Again, the point that the Ukrainian government are trying to make is that they are coming to this without preconditions, whereas Russia didn't exactly accept the proposal. It accepted it with nuances. It accepted it with discussions, with further conditions that Putin wants to impose on Ukraine, in conditions that may give Russia an upper hand in any military confrontation that follows a ceasefire, a 30-day temporary truce. So the Ukrainians are very clear-eyed about what the Russians are trying to do. They're trying to warn the Americans not to fall for what they see as deceptions and manipulations from Putin. The question is now really, how does America respond to this? And only one man in the White House can decide how the US moves forward with these proposals.
Okay, many thanks. Oz Katerji reporting live from Kyiv. With Europe being on the sidelines of the Ukraine-US peace talks, the focus now shifts to what comes next. With growing uncertainty and rising defense budgets, how should NATO and the EU adapt? Our reporter Alexandra Marhevich is at the Warsaw European Conversation with Camille Grand, Distinguished Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, to discuss Europe's next steps.
With ongoing instability in Europe and growing security concerns, one key question remains. What now for European defence and European nuclear? So I am now here at Warsaw European Conversation with Camille Grand, now Distinguished Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, but previously with NATO. So I want to ask you first, now, how do you assess the current state of European security landscape following ceasefire in Ukraine, especially nuclear-wise? Do you think Europe has awakened nuclear-wise?
I think we've awakened security-wise. We are obviously in a very different environment than we were 5 years ago or even 5 months ago. So from that perspective, the nuclear dimension of that conversation is emerging. We've seen it with the statements of the Polish Prime Minister, with the offer of the French President, but also with the comments of the likely next Chancellor in Germany. So we have an opening of a conversation which should be understood not as something that should undermine the US extended nuclear deterrent that everyone values as long as it is here, but that offers additional security to Europe. And this is something that requires not only France and Britain, the two nuclear weapon states in Europe, to work together, but also to work with the non-nuclear countries, such as Germany or Poland, to understand better what are the demands, to understand better what can be done together. And there are lots of things that could happen that have not been explored yet. So I would argue that we're at the beginning of a nuclear cycle that will eventually deliver new ways of strengthening nuclear deterrence across the continent. I very much hope NATO is going to stay, because NATO has a unique value when it comes to command and control arrangements, to the planning for the security of Europe, and we wouldn't want to lose that. What I believe is that what we will see emerge is a sort of NATO 3.0, which will be very different from the post-Cold War NATO that was very focused on out-of-area operations, Afghanistan, the Balkans and all of that, to a NATO, and very different probably from the NATO 1.0, which was the Cold War NATO, which gave a very central role to the US. So the features of this NATO 3.0 is a much more European NATO in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of roles and responsibilities within the alliance. It's a NATO where the US will be hopefully present, but more over the horizon. And we are already seeing some of that. You know, US presence is 1/3 of what it was during the Cold War in Europe. It's likely to continue to shrink. The Europeans are taking a larger share of the burden as we speak. We see more and more countries being serious on defense and developing and acquiring the capabilities that are critical. We need to see more of that.
And that was Camille Grand from Warsaw European Conversation. And you heard it here first, that definitely Europe needs a NATO 3.0. From Warsaw for TVP World, Aleksandra Marchewicz.
Vladimir Putin wants some sort of control over Ukraine, which will ultimately mean the de-Ukrainization of Ukraine. That's what TVP World's guest analyst Andreas Umland said, answering a question about the proposed Ukraine-Russia peace deal.
I don't even think that this sort of trampling of international law will be sufficient for Putin. He wants more, and he wants eventually some sort of control over Ukraine. He calls that denazification, which means de facto a de-Ukrainization, a de-sovereignization of Ukraine, and transforming Ukraine again into a Russian protectorate.
US Vice President J.D. Vance has responded to the Polish president's proposal of redeploying American nuclear warheads to Poland. As stated by Vance in an interview for American TV channel Fox News, he would be shocked if Donald Trump agreed to Andrzej Duda's idea.
Vance said he has not discussed the matter with Trump. However, he doesn't think the US president would agree to it. Vance was asked about a recent interview Andrzej Duda gave to the British Financial Times, where he called on Washington to redeploy nuclear weapons to Poland. As stated by the Polish president, it would make for a nuclear deterrent against aggression from Russia. Furthermore, Andrzej Duda noted that as the border of NATO changed in 1999, so should its weapon deployment plans. Not everyone in Poland, however, is on the same page, as yesterday Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk criticized Duda, saying such matters should be discussed quietly and not in front of the world press.
Polish President Andrzej Duda's idea of the United States deploying some of its nuclear arsenal in Poland drew comments from all over Europe. However, it is not Warsaw's first time suggesting Washington base its nuclear weapons in the country. According to our guest from Globsec, Tomasz Nać, the proposal is consistent with Poland's ambition of doing more nuclear deterrence.
This is not the first time that Poland has been vocally advocating for an increased role in NATO's nuclear sharing, and it's probably by slight margin, probably the most ambitious exclamation of Polish ambition to do more nuclear deterrence. But this is consistent with what we have been hearing from Poland, both publicly and behind closed doors. And it's also reflective of the security situation in Europe, because one of the direct implications of the war of Russia against Ukraine is that nuclear weapons matter, and nuclear deterrence is an integral part of the overall deterrence picture. And Poland wants to have a pretty sizable role within that overall deterrence picture.
And that concludes World News at the top of the hour. Thanks for joining us, and stay tuned for more on TVP World.